Marketing Monday. I am so excited because this week I am joined by my fellow marketing maven, Miss Nicole Mattiello. How are you?
I'm great. So glad to be here, Allie. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
I'm so excited we're connecting again. I feel
Yes.
like it's been forever. So it's exciting to talk a little marketing with you.
Absolutely.
So today we're talking about creativity and finding that creative spark and really like propelling yourself in this really content rich environment we're in.
Yeah.
Seems like everybody's putting out content and everybody's doing it a little bit differently. So how do you stay on top of it? How do you continue to have that spark and where's it going? What are we going to do? So
Yeah.
I'm going to start with Nicole. How do you kind of find your creative spark?
That's it's a great question. And it's a question I ask myself sometimes too, right? Because you're trying to find a solution or looking at a problem and maybe
Mhm.
you're a little bit struggling and you're like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And I'll show this. And I think I said this to you the other day. My daughter and I were coloring. I didn't make it that far.
Mhm.
But we were coloring. On the back of the page, there's like a little quote and it said, you can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have. And that's a Maya Angelou.
Yeah.
And it was funny because when you and I talked subsequently, I was like, oh, I was just thinking about that.
Mhm.
It was because of this. And I think it's so tough sometimes to get yourself started to, you have something you have to consider or solve for,
Mhm.
but it can be a little bit of a drain, right? Especially if
Right.
you're not in the right mindset and you're trying to find that path forward, trying to figure out like, okay, where do I go from here? And a lot of times I think it's one of those things you just have to get started.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know about you, so I'll ask for your tactics, but I find that sometimes my best ideas come in the most totally unexpected times, like
Mhm.
I should be asleep kind of times. And I wake up and I'm like, "Look, I have this idea. Well, I'm not going to like turn on the light and get out of bed and write it
Right.
down. But, I have like that keep notes app on my phone. And so I
Mhm.
write under the covers. I write it all up so I don't wake my husband or
Yeah.
anything. But I try to think through those kind of things or, a voice recorder type
Mhm.
situation where I just had a sudden thought, I'm in the car or whatever. And then I try to use that as like feeder material, right? For the future. When I do have a
Yeah.
little time that I can devote and like say, okay, I'm going to sit down and block this out and think about whatever
Mhm.
this creative issue I have before me might be.
Yeah. I think I do something very similar. And I'll say it's a little bit different though, because my best ideas come to me when I am hiking, when I'm running on the treadmill, when I'm out there
Yeah.
being active and doing something and not necessarily thinking about work. And I think you hit on a really good
Mm-hmm.
point there. Whenever you're trying to think creatively, you're sitting there banging your head against the wall. That's all
Doesn't
you're
work.
doing. You're going,
Yeah.
I can't think of a single idea. I'll give an example. I was writing a landing page, putting all
Mm.
this content together, and I'm like, what am I doing? Like, this is all so dry and stiff, and I really want to make this a little bit more fun. And so I took a step away and I went on a walk. And while I was walking, rather than like thinking about the problem, I decided to put on a podcast. And while I was listening to the podcast, something that they said like sparked it. And I'm like,
Clicked.
oh, that's it. That's it. That's how I need to frame this. And so it goes back to I had this professor in college, and
Mm-hmm.
he was like, never feel guilty for watching, videos online, never feel guilty about watching TV, never feel guilty about any of this when you're in a creative space, because in order to create, you need input. And then you need time to
Mm-hmm.
digest that to create the output. And so I think I do a little bit of that. If I'm stuck in a bubble, I'll go on that walk, I'll do those things, I'll listen to a podcast, I'll throw on a couple
Totally.
TikToks and just like digest what seemingly is mindless content that you would feel guilty about wasting time. But in
Mm-hmm.
actuality, it's getting your brain thinking in different ways. I think that's really the direction I go too, is like, let's step away from it and then we'll
Yeah.
come back into it. I think the other thing, and we were talking about this before, was having that creative conversation and partner.
Well, I think you have two different kinds of muses, right? You have somebody who probably thinks like you. Hey guys, that's me and Allie. We think pretty similarly. So sometimes if I have an idea I already feel kind of good about, but I
Yeah.
need that extra um touch something, right? Like a
Hmm.
little bit more. I know I'm missing some element that I think, hey, she could add to this conversation.
Hmm.
So, I pull in that person when I'm in need of that kind of aspect. But there are other times where maybe I like my idea, but I'm questioning myself.
Right.
And
Right.
that's when I like to pull in like a totally different thinker, somebody who's totally, they're going to approach it so differently from me, and they're going to question it. I think there's nothing wrong with that. The best thing is to get somebody to question even your logic, right? Because a lot of times I'll
Right.
sit down and I'll have thought something through and I think it's brilliant. Probably isn't. So you need somebody else to take a look at that and then question you and feel good about, hey, this
Right.
exchange is going to help me make it better. And,
Mhm.
another thing I love to say, you'll see a lot of times people will talk about, you have to be willing to fail with creative efforts. At the same time, I feel like, is there really a failure? You
Good
can,
question.
yeah. So, okay, I'll let you go because I question if there's such thing as failure.
I don't think there is. I think anytime that we quote unquote fail, it's a learning experience. And I think beyond that, I think you were trying something.
Mhm.
And if we all sat back and were afraid to try different things or try different approaches, we wouldn't end up with best practices. And so I don't
Yes.
think there's a possibility. It's just finding a worst practice instead of a best
Like that.
practice.
I like that. There is a worst practice. And it doesn't mean sometimes it won't work though,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes even when you come up with something that's not fabulous, it still was pretty good.
Yeah.
And so I think you can learn from that. And it's just an evolution. I'm a big believer
Hmm.
in evolution. Nothing, and Allie, I know you're very similar in this respect, but having a background in like the performing arts, right?
Hmm.
Anytime if you're performing a piece of music or whatever,
It's
no
never going
two
to be the
times are good.
same.
No, never going to be the same. It doesn't make one a failure, right? And like
Right.
I taught for a long time, students in the musical area,
Hmm.
we'll say, and you don't want to discourage that creativity, right? Even if
Right.
they had a rough show, and they knew it usually,
Yeah.
unfortunately, and you kind of did too. Like, well, they could have done better, but that
Hmm.
doesn't mean this was a failure.
Right.
It still is something that you're getting great feedback
It's a
from.
stepping stone.
Yes. And you're learning
Yeah.
from it, and it's exciting to do it. And you should still feel a big sense of reward from
Yeah.
that journey. And I think there's so much to be said. If everybody just stopped the first time that they felt like creatively they were a failure, then what would we have?
I
Right.
think this can be applied to so right now we're seeing like this huge influx of video content. I mean, and
Yes.
we've been seeing it for years. But
Hmm.
I think this can also apply to how do you stand out in this media rich environment? And
Yeah.
it's trying those new things and not being afraid to put that 7 minute video up because someone told you that nobody watches a 7 minute video. And
Maybe
I'm
they
not saying
do.
this is a personal experience.
Maybe
I
they're
just got
still
real
watching. Let's
sassy.
find out. Let's ask. Are
Yeah.
you still watching?
Are you still watching? Comment
Yep.
if you're
Put
still watching.
or the insightful bulb, and then we'll know. We can count.
Yeah,
Hmm.
we can have the metrics on it. But that's one of those things where you have to be okay doing something a little different. And you
Yes.
have to step outside of that comfort zone. And I think, is it, a 30-second video is going to get the most attention? Or did you need to do a 4 minute video that brought a skeleton? I mean, where do people really want to look? And why would okay,
Maybe
who
the
would,
skeleton.
I mean, but I think about,
Yeah.
you know, bringing in that
Mhm.
creative element that maybe doesn't necessarily make the most sense, but it
No.
gets the attention, and then you can share your greater message because
Yeah.
you have someone's attention.
Mhm.
It's a little bit more engaging, it's more entertaining,
Absolutely.
and it's fun. I
Absolutely.
mean, creativity should be fun, and
It should.
marketing and sales and business should be fun.
Mhm.
It's I mean, we're dedicating our lives to it.
100%.
So
I could not agree with you more. And it's funny you brought up the skeleton. Those who don't know, maybe you can share some outtakes
I'll
someday.
put
But Allie and I had an adventure with a skeleton last year around Halloween. I will say, I think there's a lot to be said for finding something unique and not even repeating it necessarily. You
right.
can keep changing that hook because anything can become a little bit mundane when you've seen perhaps too much of it,
Yeah.
right? And maybe it actually stagnates you too. And so it's
Hmm.
harder to come up with a new idea when you've been doing the same thing so many times. And I think a lot
Right.
of times we have a little bit of fear about stepping outside of that comfort zone, right?
Right.
Like, hey, I've done it 100 times and like, okay, 98 times it worked great. Why would I
Right.
change it? That I know that's
Yeah.
tough. That is a big hurdle. I understand like wanting to be like, this is cool,
Right.
it's working. But I do think there's so much value in just trying the new thing and
Mm-hmm.
not shying away. I think in business, so often we're a little bit afraid, what does professional look like?
Right.
What does business content what does that look like? What does that feel like? How are people going to react?
Right.
And yet I'll challenge, who doesn't think Wendy's on,
Oh,
Twitter, TikTok, whatever, who doesn't
right.
think they're hilarious? They're hilarious.
Right.
Just
Well,
no
and I think
question
there's a
about it.
line. There's a line. There's a
Mhm.
line between like they're not
Absolutely.
insulting anybody. They're just
Nope.
making blanket comedic statements. And
Nothing wrong with that.
no, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And I think it even goes going back to our little skeleton friend. It did its job. I mean,
It did.
people knew where we were going to be, what we were doing. The number of
Yep.
times I've had somebody reach out and be like, "Where's Dave? Where's Dave?"
We
And
miss
it's
him.
and it's one of those things where if it does the job, it doesn't have to be perfect or
No.
professional. And I think as content creators,
Mhm.
which in marketing we are today, you can look at something and you can do it on your phone. You could do it
Absolutely.
on a Zoom video. You could do it on, whatever medium. And if the content's there and someone's entertained by it, they don't
You did a
care
good
if it was
job.
shot on, a giant camera that you're lugging around on your shoulder or if it was on this thing.
Oh, 100%. And I think like that actually it gives you so much more freedom because
Yeah.
you can one of the things that I know I've often read, and I'm sure you have too, is that when you're looking for that spark of creativity, go somewhere different,
Yep.
right? Or go somewhere that inspires you. One or the other. I think both work depending upon what you're trying to do. But
Hmm.
if I go somewhere I've never been, I'm probably going to get different ideas in my head or different
Yeah.
exposure than if it was somewhere I'm at all the time. But I also, if I'm there all the time and I love it, I have this sense of peace, right? And
Right.
so I can feel very comfortable in that space. And like you said earlier, kind of turn my mind off.
Experiences open your mind and they make
Yes.
you think different ways and experiencing new places and cultures and it
Oh my
really
gosh, right?
changes your perspective. And I think if there's anything that you could take away about being creative, it's stepping outside of your comfort zone is where you really
Mhm.
find that creativity.
I totally agree with that. I think like there's absolutely nothing wrong with trying to find a new story somewhere you haven't been before.
Yeah.
Right? Like go explore, see what's different, see where, and like, so I mentioned to you the other day, maybe we'll end up there, but I mentioned
Mhm.
to you, I didn't get to go last week. My family went to the Cascades in South Park, which is
Ah.
an old place, but a new
Mhm.
place because they refurbished it. And so for people who aren't familiar, Allie and I are in Pittsburgh, and this is like kind of like a, I don't know how to describe it, but I guess it's like a
Like a
natural
water
pool.
staircase.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's kind of built to be like a natural pool that I think originally was built in maybe like the 20s or 30s. It's older and it got overgrown over the course of our lifetimes. I never heard of it,
Mhm.
frankly. And they just rebuilt and opened those right around the pandemic, I think. I
Mhm.
forget exactly which year, but my kids have been wanting to go. So my husband took them and I'm not kidding when I say they were literally inspired by it. They've been
Oh,
to go back and they love the atmosphere. They felt like this is the coolest thing they ever saw.
yeah.
And it's just like these little pools, with stone around them and in the middle of the trees. And it got them thinking, I
Mhm.
guess. And I think that anywhere you end up, you can kind of find that
Yeah.
unique situation. You're like, wow, especially if you've never been there before, sometimes it can
Right.
be just kind of exciting to see
Yeah.
something new.
Try new things, do new things. It's how we
Always.
spark creativity.
I agree.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. And to everybody who joined us, have a wonderful Marketing Monday.
Thanks so much, Allie.
Bye.